Hi, my name's Tony Ennis and I'd like to welcome you to my 009 gauge industrial layout, Matthew & Son Engineers. Firstly, I'd like to explain for those of you who are not aware the difference between 00N and 009 gauges. Most people will be familiar with 00 gauge, that's the wagon on the left at the front, and most of you will also be familiar with N gauge, which is 2mm to the foot scale and is the small brown wagon in front of the green loco. In the middle we have 00 gauge, 009, which runs on the same width track as N gauge, but it is the equivalent of a 2'3" gauge narrow gauge. This has some advantages in that you can get quite a lot of railway into a small space and still have the variety of 00 gauge houses and buildings and scenery to pick from. The two locomotives are both Peckarts. The one on the right in the paler green is standard Hornby Peckart 00 gauge, and the darker green one is a 009 gauge locomotive which runs on the narrow gauge track. As I mentioned earlier, this is a small factory layout and it is designed to run small goods stock of the type that would be found typically at maybe a brickworks or a brewery layout or something similar, and many factories used small railways before road transport became really viable to move heavy goods around the factories, and even things like potato railways, which were quite common in Lincolnshire. Quarries, most quarries had small narrow gauge railways, and various other industrial places, including the Guinness Brewery in Dublin, which had a very extensive 2-foot gauge railway. The small locomotive running around at the moment is a Mini Trains Gemeinde, which is straight out of the box. I have another one which has been heavily weathered, followed by two off-the-shelf Pico Linton and Barnstaple wagons of a type that were fairly commonly used, and a kit-built brake van. I'll just allow that to come around again. I've put a selection of other stock out on the layout, and these are the kinds that you would commonly find running round. So coal wagons to the front, which are kit built and of 3 different varieties, and a scratch built brake van in blue in front of them by the coal staiths. The small hut visible just to the right of these is an Airfix kit, and the tanks at the back are Wills kits, the large building being an Airfix, a Hornby Scaledale kit. Many narrow gauge lines used repurposed buses placed onto very crude rail chassis in order to carry passengers round. I've got 2 examples here. This one running is actually a Corgi die-cast model mounted on a Japanese chassis. The other one is also a die-cast model, albeit not a Corgi, and again mounted on a Japanese N-gauge chassis. These are broadly representative of the fairly crude transport for passengers, which were often very rough and ready, uncomfortable, cold and drafty. However, small narrow gauge railways ran at minimum cost, and these were often the cheapest means of transporting passengers. And you'll find these all over the world, from Brazil to Ireland, in one form or another. Next up we have a tanker train of rather untidy tankers, typical of those that have had a very hard working life. And these are being pulled off by a small 040 diesel locomotive, and will be coming round through the back and out of the other side of the factory in a moment, hopefully. And these are representative of the type of oil tankers that would be commonly used to transport fuel oil on small lines. The tankers are actually made from Triang TT tank wagons, which have been placed onto Pico N-gauge chassis, and these really work rather well once they've been weathered. The locomotive has been repainted from bright orange, it's actually a 1950s prototype, into a more subtle green. The locomotive coming round now is a model of the Campbelltown and Machrihanish Light Railways Chevalier, which is a small locomotive which ran for quite a number of years on this Scottish railway, and it is actually a model of a 2'3" gauge locomotive. With it are a number of kit-built wagons, which you can see have loads in them. As you may have noticed, the observant among you, there are several bits of Airfix engine shed littered around this particular model railway. At the sides, where I used nice cheap Airfix models to create scenery. This is a very nice running locomotive as well. It runs on a mini train chassis and a white metal kit body, so it's quite heavy and will pull more or less anything. Next up we have our little Peckett steam locomotive on a very short train, plodding along quietly. This is a very nice little locomotive built by a gentleman called Paul Windle of Hull Model Railway Society, and Paul scratch builds these locomotives out of plasticard sheet and various bits and pieces. They're very well sought after in the 009 world, and Paul is an exceptional modeller. I'm very fortunate in having a couple of his locomotives, of which this is probably my favourite. We do like to keep our younger watchers amused, and so very occasionally we have a visitor to the line, or a couple of visitors to the line strictly, and I like to send this loco and train round at times when mum and dad have looked away and are busy talking to each other or something, and it's usually accompanied by screams of "Dirty Diesel, look a Dalek!" Sometimes we like to challenge people as to what's going on in the yard. I do have a film crew who seem to have disappeared today, but the cars should remind people of a 1970s cops and robbers show, which usually involved a Ford Transit and a pile of boxes and a couple of police cars and a certain bunch of people having a fight in a factory yard or something similar. For those of you too young to remember the 70s, it's the Sweeney, and oddly enough the Ford Consul, the brownie coloured car, has the correct registration number for Jack Regan's car in the Sweeney. Finally, a very brief overview of the layout to give you an idea of the compact dimensions. As I say, this is only 3 feet 6 by 2 feet 6. It's built on 6mm ply base with 2 inch by 1 inch edging and cross bracing. It's so light it can be picked up and carried with one hand, although that's a bit unwieldy, and it fits nicely in the back of an average hatchback. So it's a very transportable layout. It's been to a number of exhibitions over the years, but it's kind of reached the end of its life now, and I have another layout on the way. Hopefully, if we're all back to normal next year, I might get an invite down to Cambridge and actually meet you all in the flesh and be able to talk about the railway and 009 and various other items of interest. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope that this has been of interest to you.